Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the first of the AFAC AIDR Lessons Management webinar series. My name is Christine Owen, and I'm going to be facilitating today's webinar. For this first webinar, we are very fortunate to be joined by Australia's two Inspectors General for Emergency Management. In the southern corner, we have Tony Pearce, Inspector General for Emergency Management Victoria, and in the northern corner, we have Alistair Dawson, Inspector General, Emergency Management, Queensland. I'm not going to read their bios to you because they were included in the material that you received when you registered for this event. But I would like to acknowledge their extensive experience and expertise that they both bring to these roles. I'm going to ask them to provide their insights shortly, and those insights are going to be about their reviews of the previous bushfire events. They're going to compare those reviews to previous reviews they've undertaken. And in the process, they're going to reflect on the challenges for the lessons process. I will now ask Stuart Ellis, CEO of AFAC, to provide the formal welcome and introduction. Stuart.
Thank you, Christine, and welcome to you all for being here and joining the seminar, and thank you, Christine, for being our facilitator. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting here today across Australia. Here in Melbourne, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I'm sure you will know who your traditional owners are in where you are currently located. So can I start by thanking you all for joining us? And if you are like me, I'm really looking forward to hearing from both Tony and Alistair, with both of them being highly experienced Inspector Generals Emergency Management. And I'm very grateful for them making themselves available because it reflects a real commitment to lessons management, which is something which they are very committed to, I know. We'd all be aware of the current reviews and investigations being conducted, and indeed some have already been concluded in Queensland, South Australia, and as ongoing in Victoria, New South Wales. There's Senate inquiries, and of course also the Royal Commission. These are all important activities and essential to improving our performance and understanding. And I know we all value these independent reviews into what has occurred. In 2017, I asked the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC to commission a tactical research project to identify the recommendations from reviews over the last 9 years. There had in fact been 140 reviews, but they focused in on 56 and analysed 1,316 recommendations. Add to that what we're identifying this year, and it's clear that there is much to learn. Our speakers today will assist us in the understanding of how those recommendations are identified. We also need to reflect as to how we will learn from them and integrate them into our practice. I'm confident that we'll get some valuable insights both today and during future seminars. So I look forward to sharing those with you. Thanks very much, and thank you. Christine, back to you.
Thank you, Stuart. Some housekeeping before we get started. The session will run for the remainder of the hour, and we will hear from each of our presenters for about 20 minutes each. Following that, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and I will be asking those questions based on the questions you pose through using the question and answer function. Now, you might be pleased to hear that you're all on mute, so that if the phone goes off or the dog barks or somebody comes to the door, you won't be disturbing us. But what it does mean is that you'll need to use the Q&A function, which you can see at the bottom of your screen, and type your question there. If, when you're looking over the questions that have already been posed, if some of those resonate for you, if they strike a chord, then you can add a like to that question, and in which case questions with more likes will come further up the list, and they will be the ones that I'll be able to prioritise. Finally, please note that we've had about 500 people, over 500 people register for this webinar, which is just fantastic. And so thank you for doing that and showing your interest. Please also just bear with us if there are any technological hitches. And please also note that we are recording this webinar, and I'll say more about where the link will be on the AIDR website at the end of today. So now I'd like to hand over to our first speaker for the day, Tony Pearce, Inspector General for Emergency Management Victoria. Tony.
Yes, good morning, Christine. And have I unmuted? Yep, beautiful, thank you. So good morning, Christine, and everybody who's online. And it gives me great pleasure. And thank you, Stuart, for the invitation to participate today. And again, it's a pleasure to be able to do so with Alistair, the other IGEM, if you like, in Australia. I thought very quickly, I just put a couple of slides up just for a bit of colour and movement before you have to sit there just looking at my head for the rest of the presentation, just to give you a bit of a sense of where IGEM has come from and why we exist. Of course, everyone would be still very cognizant of the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009, from which we had a Royal Commission in Victoria. But not long after that, the following year, we had probably the most significant floods that had impacted our state in a long time. And as a result of that, there was another inquiry conducted by Mr. Neil Comrie, who was the former Chief Commissioner of Victoria Police, into the flood review. Both of those inquiries identified a number of things that were missing from their perception as far as the effectiveness of our system goes. One of those being a capacity to assure the system and have an ongoing monitoring and review process in place for continuous improvement. Hence, as a result of that, IGEM was born. To give you just a bit of a sense of the journey that we went on, we had the Royal Commission, as I said, and delivered its findings in 2010. We then had the flood review in 2011. And from both of those, the government of the day chose to go through a white paper process. The white paper revealed a number of reform elements, if you like, to a broader reform system or strategy. As a result of that, the emergency management legislation addressing the white paper was developed in 2013, implemented in 2014, 1st of July 2014, and one aspect of that was the Inspector General for Emergency Management, which if you have any interest at all, you can go to the legislation, and we're in part 7 of that if you're a bit of a legislation junkie. In the legislation, there are 2 primary objectives for IGEM. One is to provide assurance to the government and the community in respect of our arrangements, and the second one is to foster continuous improvement. And the beauty of those objectives, I guess, is they are very high level and they allow myself and my team, and then in partnership with the sector and the community, to articulate effectively what that actually means. So there is a lot of scope for us to develop our system underneath those 2 objectives. We've got a total currently of 11 functions, and I say currently because we get more introduced every now and again. We had a couple introduced as the result of our last legislation amendment bill, but there are 11 functions that fall into 5 broad categories, I guess, which are conducting planned reviews, where obviously we know what it is that we're going to look at, and there's a strategy and a rationale for that. We have ministers' requests, reviews or inquiries, which of course this year's bushfire inquiry would fit into that bracket. We have implementation monitoring functions, which is making sure that all of the recommendations from any level of review, whether it's ours or a parliamentary inquiry or a Royal Commission, that if accepted by government, then we have to monitor those through to acquittal. So that's probably, I would suggest, is one of the most important functions that we perform. We have a performance monitoring role, and we also have a formal investigation role in one part of our business. It was important from early days to be able to, and I won't read that to you, you can read it yourself, but what it effectively does is I suppose, articulate and define what assurance is in the context of our emergency management system in Victoria. So much in the same way, if you were to ask someone what resilience is, you'll get 50 different versions of that. You would get the same, I'm sure, from an assurance perspective and many others. Therefore, we wanted to make sure that there was at least a line in the sand, if you like, to try and describe what it is that assurance is. So that's how we would how we articulate and define our assurance in Victoria, and it's in our assurance framework for emergency management, which you can see on the screen there at the moment. And this effectively is the guiding principle-based document that defines how assurance activities are conducted in the state. And it's not just talking about IGEM. And you'll notice if you do go onto our website, all of our reports that are on there and our inquiries and so on have been published. All of them have the IGEM logo on them. This is the only one that doesn't. And the reason for that is that whilst in legislation we're responsible for developing and implementing this, we are not the only entity that has an assurance obligation. Every organisation does, and every tier of emergency management has an assurance obligation. So therefore, this is, if you like, the guiding document for the state in the way that we go about from bottom to top, assuring the system. And it's principles based rather than being prescriptive by methodology or otherwise. And what it's designed to do is to make sure that everything we do at any level that we do it, that there is actually a continuous improvement outcome. If we're doing things that aren't going to deliver a tangible, measurable outcome, then they shouldn't be done. It's about how to collaborate across and up and down the sector, and also then with communities and other elements to make sure that our activities are those that are delivering, a tangible benefit. It's about adding value. If what we do doesn't add value, and if you can't measure it and show how it adds value, then we shouldn't be doing it. So therefore, it's about trying to reduce the wasted energy that often goes into things that have a good policy intent behind them, but then get a bit out of control down the track. And also about reducing burden. And Stuart alluded a minute ago in discussion about the number of activities that are going on at the moment in regard to inquiries and reviews. And of course, with COVID underway at the moment, they will just grow and grow, and there will be more of them. Therefore, when we conduct an inquiry or an assurance activity, we try to, as best we can, reduce the significant amount of burden that occurs when we conduct those activities. I'm thinking you should be able to see me rather than my presentation screen with a bit of luck. And Christine's nodding her head, so yep, that's okay. I'm in business. So if I now talk a little bit about the inquiry that we're currently undertaking with this bushfire season, and I mentioned the different types of work we do, which includes the ministerial requests. Well, obviously, this inquiry actually comes from one of those ministerial requests. So 14th of January this year, the Premier announced that there would be an independent inquiry into the Victorian bushfire season. And announced that the IGEM would be conducting that. It wasn't until February that we actually got our finalised terms of reference. So there was a 4-week period in which we were sort of in limbo, if you like, waiting for the defined terms of reference, which are obviously critical for you to be able to get on with it. Fortunately, because of our existence and our experiences of the past, we had a sense that we were probably going to get some work out of it. So over that 4-week period and leading up to it, we'd already been doing a lot of analysis and a lot of gathering of data. So it wasn't a wasted 4 weeks, if you like. And we eventually ended up with 15 primary terms of reference and another 10 sub-terms of reference. So about 25 in all, if you like. And if you go again to our website or other locations, you'll be able to see the detail of those terms of reference, but they are really quite broad ranging. The inquiry is being conducted in 2 phases, the first of which is actually, fingers crossed, actually going to the Minister this afternoon. I'm hoping that the report will be finalised by this afternoon on phase 1, and that will go to the Minister. Due by Friday, so we'll have come in a couple of days early, which is a bonus. And then the second phase, which looks at the immediate relief and the recovery arrangements, is due for delivery on the 30th of June next year. Both phase 1 and phase 2 reports will be published, and they will be tabled in Parliament along with the government response to each of the recommendations that I've made in those. Obviously today I can't tell you what they are because government hasn't seen them yet, but you'll be privy to those in the not too distant future. I think something that's important in this, and it goes back again to that burden of inquiry and the frequency and the numbers of them. When we conduct an inquiry and when I lead that, then there are a number of principles that I personally like to make sure that I try and adhere to. Firstly, that it's a no fault, no blame approach. Therefore, what we are looking at as IGEM is the system. We are not looking to identify an individual or an organisation that did a particular thing at a particular time that then you can point your finger at and say, there's the guilty party. That's not what our inquiries are about. They're actually about how can we ensure that the system itself does not create opportunities for decisions to be made that might be less than desirable, or for activities to be undertaken that might be less than desirable. Because in all cases, 99.9% at least, everybody goes to work to do the right thing, as we know. And in our sector, you're looking for a good outcome and a better outcome for communities. Therefore, the system itself is what creates opportunity for decisions to be taken potentially that may not have got the right outcome. So that's what our inquiries are about. There's no good or bad starting point, if you like. There's no preconceived idea about whether it was a good, bad response or otherwise. I watch what goes on as dispassionately as anyone else does around me, and I think more about my family situation than my day-to-day life in the midst of a disaster, the same as everyone else does, until I'm actually taking or conducting the work. And it's then that I start to form opinions as I hear what I need to hear and as I'm able to gather the evidence to support what it is that I'm hearing. As I said before, the inquiry should add as little additional burden as possible to anybody, and particularly the communities who've been affected by fire, because when they contribute, they're highly emotional still, and they are going through the very early stages of the shock of that event, even though the impact may have manifested itself fully. Their ongoing experience is something that we don't want to contribute any worse sense to. And everyone's experience is their experience. It doesn't matter what they say, how they articulate it, how they describe it, what they saw at the time and what they experienced is what they saw and what they experienced. It's not my job to try and second guess it, nor is it my job to say, oh, but hang on a second, I know that that's not exactly how it works at all. My job is to hear what's said. And if I think there is something significant in that, then to try and find the evidence that either underpins it or shows how that wasn't actually the case in a productive and positive way. So that's what it's about. We have, much like, and Mark Cuthbert spoke to me about this, about oil and the oil process. And whilst we're working, I guess, a layer above the lessons layer, if you like, in that context, our findings and our observations and that are not that dissimilar to oil. So therefore, findings are akin to insights in the context of oil. They're not that dissimilar, and the way they're described in our framework is not that dissimilar. Observations similarly are very much the same as the observations and the description that you have in oil. And of course, then our recommendations stand alone. So whilst I don't refer to oil, it doesn't mean to say that the concepts that run through that process aren't the same. The methodology for this inquiry, just to give you a sense of how we went about it. I spent a week in Gippsland and the Northeast as soon as the inquiry was announced, just to get my head around the complexity and the scale of the event, and to try and make sure that I really understood what it was that I was looking at. And in that time, about 10 hours of that time was spent flying around the perimeter of all of those fires, from the far east right the way up to the top of the northeast, to make sure that I could understand the scale of them, but also importantly to try and get an understanding of where previous fuel reduction burns had occurred, for example, where previous bushfires had occurred, and then to see if I could understand how they had impacted in a positive or negative way on the actual fire imprint, or footprint rather, of this particular event. We also had decided that we were going to conduct a significant number of community meetings. The Minister was very keen to ensure that every community member who was impacted in any part of Victoria who might have something to say had the opportunity to actually get to me and see me face to face. We originally had 70 face-to-face community meetings planned, and we had a schedule to be able to conduct those within a month period, so that was pretty full on. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we only got 17 of those conducted before we had to go into lockdown like everybody else. And then when you start to think about the complexities and how inquiries are impacted, we then had to come up with a way to go to a virtual online process, if you like. We did that and conducted another 9 meetings, so a total of 26 were conducted, all very positive. The communities, unfortunately, were really quite upset about the fact that we were going to have to go online, even though they were in the midst of COVID and they understood the impacts of it. They were really quite keen for us to continue face-to-face for as long as we could, but obviously there's a time where you just have to pull a pin on that. We called for public submissions and received 475, and to give you a little bit of context, I suppose the National Royal Commissions had 1,700. They're looking at all states and territories, and they're getting input from all states and territories, so nearly 500 in Victoria is pretty good, and it shows you that there is an absolute desire of people to give you their opinions and their views. We did 95 online community surveys. We had 16 interviews formal interviews with agency heads and departmental secretaries, another 4 with Commonwealth agency heads, interstate agency heads. There were 2 meetings with those. We then did numerous meetings with key operational people such as regional controllers and incident controllers and so on. More than 3,000 pieces of documentary evidence have been analysed. We had a number of third-party literature reviews conducted, and also leading into, you know, where the issues arise, I was very keen to make sure that myself and the New South Wales Inquirer, the South Australian Inquirer and the Royal Commission were all on the same page about how we were going to conduct our work. So I asked for a national meeting to be convened of all of those parties. We met in Adelaide, and we also, I guess, drew some fence lines, if you like, and put them in place as to where we were each going to go and to make sure we didn't trip over each other, because obviously an obligation is to not duplicate the work that's going on elsewhere. Some of the issues that arose throughout the inquiry and have impacted on us, well, clearly COVID-19 has, and that change to face-to-face meetings to online was a really big impact, and it was an impact on the community, as I said, who already had in their minds that they were going to be able to see me face-to-face and stand there and stare me in the eye and tell me what they'd seen and what they'd experienced. So we had to be extremely compassionate about changing that process, and also make sure that that same opportunity still existed whilst it was online. On the 20th of February, obviously, we had the Natural Disaster Arrangements Royal Commission announced by the Prime Minister, and that straight away created some complications in that it's not, in my experience, have I ever been involved in the process where you've had a National Royal Commission being conducted in the same event as the State Inquiry at the same time. So therefore, we had to work out some ground rules as to how that would work. We were keen to make sure we avoided duplication. We didn't want to add any unnecessary trauma to those that have already experienced it, and yet we were both going to be out on the ground talking face to face. And from a mercenary perspective, obviously being a state inquirer, I was keen to make sure that I got to Victorian communities and spoke to them before the National Royal Commission did, because I didn't want to have any opportunity for the impact and the emotion of what they had to say to be taken out of talking to me because they'd already spoken to someone else. So there was a little bit of obviously us trying to race ahead, if you like, to be able to do that. We were also called as IGEM as a witness to the Royal Commission, so therefore unfortunately we had to spend a fair bit of time dealing with that, as well as conducting our own inquiry. Our own people are working from home in the same way as everybody else has been doing, and of course getting access to our witnesses was problematic for a period because they're dealing with COVID, they're responding to the Royal Commission, and we couldn't get them together in a single place at one time in groups to be able to talk to them. It all had to be done in a virtual sense. So that's created obviously some complications, and it has impacts for the way in which your inquiry potentially can deliver its outcomes. I think at the end of the day, I'm absolutely satisfied that the inquiry will have identified the main issues that need to be identified in Victoria, and will make recommendations that are at the right level to allow the sector itself, with input from communities, to decide how best they address the issues that we've identified. I think the working with the Royal Commission, alongside the Royal Commission, has ended up being reasonably productive. We've certainly been able to identify how best to make sure that we don't trip over each other, and also to address issues that are complementary. So there will be things, I have no doubt, that will come out of the Royal Commission that will synergise well with what we've said at the state level. So I think there's some really good outcomes from that. And I'm also extremely satisfied in my mind that the big issues that are identified from a Victorian perspective are going to be able to be addressed should the government choose to accept the recommendations that we've made. So that will be a positive. One of the things, I guess, that does worry me to some extent is that there's, I guess, in a community sense, an opportunity for communities to get a little bit competitive in their own mind. You say Royal Commission, and that then paints a level of authority, power, integrity, and influence in people's minds. And what does worry me is that, and the same I know is the concern in New South Wales and South Australia, is that we don't end up with a situation where those who have an axe to grind or a very loud voice about a particular issue that they may have been advocating for many years, try to use the Royal Commission or the State Inquiry to pitch against each other, if you like. So we're very keen to make sure that the recommendations that we provide are ones that we know are going to get a tangible benefit for our communities, and also aren't recommendations that effectively put us into competition with those that come out of the Royal Commission, because if that were to be the case, then the learning opportunity is lost for the state. That's the eventual outcome of that. So I think recognising the time that we've got, I'll probably leave it at that at the moment, Christine, if you're happy. And then I'm very happy, obviously, to take questions at the end. And as I say, just keep your eyes open. Those recommendations will be out in public very soon.
Okay, thank you, Tony. And I'm noticing that there's been a lot of traffic on Zoom of people introducing themselves and explaining where they're from and connecting with people, which is wonderful. It's that networking aspect. But please do also use the Q&A function to ask questions, because otherwise I'll just have to make them up. Now, I will ask our next speaker, Alistair Dawson, Inspector General Emergency Management, to give his presentation. Alistair.
Thanks, Christine, and hello to everyone who has joined us here today for the webinar on lessons. My name is Alistair Dawson, and I'm the Inspector General Emergency Management here in Queensland. And it's a pleasure to join you for the first joint AFAC and AIDR Lessons Management webinar, and thank you to Christine and to Stuart for your kind invitation to the event. I understand there's over 300 people now from across Australia and New Zealand, and a big kia ora to those from New Zealand. So it is really great to have you join us here today. It's also wonderful to be presenting alongside Tony, who's my colleague. As you say, we've done a little bit of work tic-tacking across the board since my arrival in the role about a year ago, and I'm very grateful for that advice. Thank you, Tony. IGEM here in Queensland, I'll go to slide 2, thank you. IGEM in Queensland was created following an independent review in Queensland called the Police and Community Safety Review. The review report was publicly released in September 2013 and included a recommendation for the Queensland Government to create the role of Inspector General Emergency Management. The role was established in December 2013 under Ian McKenzie, and the office of the IGEM was formalised into a statutory authority on 1 July 2014 under the Disaster Management Act 2003 here in Queensland. At the time of establishing the office, the team undertook a scan of interstate and international equivalent organisations, standards and assurance frameworks to form the basis of IGEM's assurance work. And we have a commitment to working with people to effect change. So our vision is for driving continuous improvement in emergency management. And our purpose is to enhance emergency management in Queensland through collaborative partnerships, leadership and innovation. We're here to work with local, state and federal agencies to drive this continuous improvement into our disaster management system by identifying opportunities for cooperative partnerships to improve emergency management outcomes, to identify and improve capabilities, and to develop standards for disaster management to guide best practice. And we're also tasked by our Minister to undertake reviews and make recommendations or observations on matters that are considered a high priority for communities. So on slide 3, the office is developed the Emergency Management Assurance Framework in 2014 to guide its assurance activities. The framework includes 3 key areas. So it has key principles of leadership, public safety, partnership and performance, the standard for disaster management, and the assurance activities, with Tier 1 being a self-assessment level, Tier 2 a slightly higher level involving the evaluation of third-party data, and Tier 3, which is an independent review undertaken by the IGEM themselves. So on slide 4, working with the sector to develop standards is an important part of our work at IGEM. In 1988, the European Commission established the standard for cucumbers. The cucumbers couldn't be too curved, otherwise it would reduce the number that would fit in a box. So obviously, coming from a lesson that have been identified and learned, I would suggest. The IGEM has a responsibility in Queensland for developing standards in disaster management with our sector. These are shared responsibilities outlining that all agencies are responsible for doing their part. It's like a jigsaw with all the pieces coming together to form one common picture. The key outcomes, these are the actions that agencies need to take, and good practice are plans that should be scalable, interoperable and adaptable. How the agency is monitoring and improving its performance comes within accountabilities. But we all know that a standard is only as good as what you do with it. I'll go to slide 5, thank you. So lessons management is another way we help provide assurance to government and to the community. Many of you joining us here today are well versed in lessons management, and you will know many of our emergency management agencies in Australia already have processes in place at agency level to learn lessons by debriefing after disaster events and identifying what worked well and the areas for improvement. We know the wisdom of learning gained through experience, evaluation, and formal assurance activities is undeniable. While agencies are learning lessons, we know that sectors that learn effectively can be extraordinarily rare. This is not due to a lack of commitment to learning in the disaster management sector. Rather, it's the complexity of the disaster management system, the lack of formalised programs in some cases, and processes and tools that support learning across the sector. IGEM's focus is on system improvement, as you've heard Tony talk about. It's not at the agency or individual level. The office has facilitated the creation of a sector-wide lessons management framework. This was done collaboratively with representatives from across the disaster management sector in Queensland, and to help foster and develop a culture which embraces learning, change, and supports this continuous improvement and lesson sharing. And the framework is now available on our website, and if you'd like to have a look at it, please feel free to do so. In developing the lessons management framework, the office engaged with Queensland Health, an organisation with extensive experience in management to improve patient safety. A key observation from that research with Queensland Health was that for lessons to be learned and institutionalised, the act of learning lessons must be led by practitioners and enabled by leaders. It also needs a positive culture towards lessons, one that embeds the improvements made from lessons identified into common practice and thereby resulting in a lesson learned. Go to slide 6, thank you. We know the big stick approach does not work when it comes to learning lessons. We know that compliance does not necessarily drive a positive culture of change. That's why IGEM is not a regulator nor an audit office, which was a matter that was canvassed at our recent Royal Commission hearings. IGEM's role is to work with the sector to help light up the road ahead, but agencies are still the ones responsible for driving the car. That's why IGEM works with local and district groups to regularly review disaster management plans in this state to ensure that they are updated, reflective of best practice, and exercised regularly. We are about assurance, learning lessons, and driving continuous improvement in the system. You go to slide 7, please. Earlier this year, in February 2020, the Queensland Premier released the IGEM's review into the September 2019 bushfires, which concentrated on the 3 fires at Stanthorpe, Sarabah and Peregian Springs. The methodology and approach undertaken by IGEM for this review was quite different to our previous 2018 Queensland Bushfire Review. The 2019 Bushfire Review was designed to be shorter. In fact, it was 100 pages less. It was more user-friendly, easier to read, and considered and implement focus on highlighting good practice. We recognised that the 2019 review was coming hot on the heels of the 2018 Bushfire Review. So the focus was on identifying the observations, the insights, the lessons identified, and ultimately the lessons learned, which to all of you online is probably more commonly known as the OILS process. The Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience Lessons Management Handbook states that the OILS process is one approach to synthesising observations, analysing for insights, and identifying lessons. One or more observations makes an insight, and insights form part of the lessons identified. But it is the people that put all this into action and make lessons learned. Last year, the Queensland fire season started in August, and large fires were already being experienced across the state by the start of September. IGEM was tasked by the Minister for Fire and Emergency Services and Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Partnerships to focus on observations and insights arising from bushfires at these 3 locations of Sarabah, Stanthorpe and Pigeon Springs in September 2019, whilst also consolidating recommendations from the previous 2018 bushfire review. When it comes to the process for reviews, IGEM's focus is on the systems for disaster management in Queensland, rather than the actions of individuals, and Tony has talked to this at length before. Our focus is on fostering a positive lessons culture, and by doing this, highlighting good practice, as well as making recommendations for areas to improve the management of disasters on a systems-based approach. The process undertaken by the Office for conducting a review is methodical and includes issue identification and analysis. This is the most important part at the very start. Then it was research and planning, collection and analysis, and reporting phases. The length of each phase will be dependent on the activity and the tier of insurance. And throughout every activity, the appropriateness of the scope of inquiry is continually monitored. In this instance, our review team spoke to councils, fire, police, and other local officers about the bushfires. We telephoned, surveyed hundreds of local residents about their preparedness, how they received the bushfire warnings, and whether they felt prepared. The 2019 review found Queensland's pre-season bushfire preparedness, hazard reduction burns, and water bombing techniques were effective and helped to reduce the severity of the fires. It also highlighted strong and continuous improvement in the state's bushfire preparedness, mitigation, and overall firefighting response. I'll go to the next slide, please. One of the standouts of good practice was Queensland's integration of the State Emergency Service volunteers in this bushfire response, and was an example of good practice. State Emergency Service volunteers were trained in replenishing water and foam in water bombing aircraft at both Toowoomba and Stanthorpe aerodromes. The use of trained State Emergency Service officers helped to free up firefighters and result in a more effective turnaround of aircraft fighting on the front line. I'll go to the next slide, please. Hazard reduction burns also helped reduce risk and the severity of fires. And the two examples I'd like to pick on today, or highlight today, I should say, are noted in the report, and they're both called Stanthorpe and Noosa. A hazard reduction burn was undertaken at the Broadwater State Forest near Stanthorpe in July as part of the local area fire management group's planned activity. The burn highlighted the important role of area fire management groups in prioritising those burns that have been identified during planning and the involvement of all stakeholders. On page 21 of the 2019 review includes a map, and you can see it on the screen here, of the reduction burn that was undertaken by Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service and the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services officers. The post-event debriefs identified that the burn undertaken in July 2019 reduced the magnitude of the 6th of September 2019 fire and very likely saved a significant number of houses. The Noosa hazard reduction burn was a different example. It was an example of highly effective multi-agency exercise involving Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, Queensland Fire and Emergency Service, the Queensland Police Service, Queensland Ambulance Service, Department of Education, the local council, local schools, sporting clubs, aged care facility, who were all in this high priority location next to Noosa Junction Shopping Centre. And this was undertaken to mitigate a risk in a very tight environment. The report also identified highly effective community education activities such as pop-up events, school visits and community forums. The community forums were live streamed on Queensland Fire and Emergency Services online platforms, allowing thousands of people to participate virtually and answer questions through virtual question and answer sessions. Embedding liaison officers, both Queensland Ambulance, Queensland Police Service and Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service into regional operations centres and the State Operations Centre facilitated proactive interagency cooperation. But the report also looked at areas that we could improve on, such as a more balanced representation through area fire management groups. The review found that membership of these groups differed from location to location, with best practice to include all relevant landowners, both local, state and federal agencies, and to have a culture of information sharing. And the standout, as was highlighted in the report, was the area fire management group in the Stanthorpe area. Community messages and warnings simplify and make more user-friendly, such as Facebook, websites, text messages, and were found by some to be the most relied upon warning methods by the community, and this came through in the survey. Some agencies on the fire ground didn't have access to government wireless network radios. There are cases of spare radios, but given the scale of the 2019 fires, it was difficult to supply to all other agencies across the multiple simultaneous fires. And so it has created opportunities for further exploration as to how this may be better managed in the future. Liaison officers, there was also occasions where review team heard of instances where some agents had been integrated into the incident management teams. We also heard, as you would have realised, that from my earlier comments, that this was also a strength. So the actual strength is about ensuring that all key agencies are involved in incident management teams, and this will lead to a more effective and holistic response to severe fire events. Internal mapping and feedback was received that, wishing to have consistent map layers, including vegetation and fire scars provided to all regions, and the capability development for incident management. With the unprecedented fire conditions, there's provided opportunities for agencies to review incident management training for senior incident commanders. In monitoring and evaluation, we know that the job doesn't finish when the IGEM hands down its report. Our office monitors and evaluates progress on its recommendations, and there have been some 133 recommendations in total since the inception of the office. The monitoring and evaluation process starts with the Queensland Government's response to the review report. It is released by the government with a copy of the report outlining the acceptance of recommendations and the government's intent. It is enacted through an action plan that's developed by the agency with the overall responsibility for the set of recommendations. The office monitors and evaluates progress against the action plan and the extent to which the activities have been implemented. We know this process works. In the 2019 review, the office noted that Queensland Fire and Emergency Services Planning, Preparedness and Response to the September 2019 fires have been enhanced through their lessons management process. The review team heard how Queensland Fire and Emergency Services used its lessons identified from the Wallangarra fires in 2019 to put in place improved community engagement programs, including a number of education sessions, advising the community on how to prepare and enact bushfire survival plans. As one senior Queensland Fire and Emergency Services commander observed about the use of their lessons management system during the February 2019 Wallangarra fires, they said, we used the new lessons management management for the first time during the Wallangarra fires. They flagged things for us that we probably had already thought about, but we hadn't got around to doing. These sort of lessons have also been acknowledged at the recent Royal Commission's hearings. We have seen good work, but there's still good work to be done. And learning lessons is not a journey, but is a journey, but not a destination. And it is vital that agency lessons transcend across sectors and then are embedded as lessons learned so that we can all take benefit from those lessons that have been identified. Last slide, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alistair, for that. And now we will move, in fact, into the question and answer session. I can tell on the chat line that there are two questions that are neck and neck in terms of getting likes, and both of them relate to communities. So I'll put the first one, and perhaps we'll put it first to Tony Tony and then to Alistair. So the question is, what did you learn about remote engagement with communities? What worked, what didn't? Over to you, Tony.
I think, yeah, remote engagement is interesting. I'm assuming the question comes from an inquirer's perspective rather than more generally engagement. But I guess I'll answer it with both of those environments in mind. One thing we learned, and I, to some extent, I'm somewhat lucky. Our office, when it was first opened, 1st of July 2014, the very first job it got was to go down to the very, very far east of East Gippsland to an area around Bonang Goongerah, as it's called, a very remote location just below the New South Wales border that had suffered some significant fires. And as a result of that, we got first-hand experience and exposure to what remote communities and isolated communities are like and how they're impacted by not only the event, but the way in which the state then responds to that event and engages with them as a part of that response and the lead up to it. 6 years on, the very same area again has been very badly affected, and we've had an opportunity as a result of that, because we've had an ongoing relationship with that community looking at the implementation of previous recommendations, to go back and effectively get them to tell us how things have changed and to utilise the opportunity to provide their evidence in doing that, and also for us to look at what we'd seen over the journey as well. And what we have learned, I suppose, is that you can plan as much as you like for a standard response, if you like, to a more traditional event occurring in a more known and easier to respond to area. But when those events impact on these more remote communities, then it's very, very important to be engaged with them on an ongoing basis rather than only when the event occurs, because things are, the environment is such a changing one for them. The only thing that doesn't change is the isolation and the remoteness, but their environment changes constantly. And if your thinking is that you can just simply respond to something in a reactive way in the same way that you did last time, and you'll get a better outcome if the last one wasn't so good, then you may be in a situation where you're going to find that's not the case. So I would suggest that engagement with these communities is critical, not only in responding, so as they actually understand what's happening on the day and they can contribute to that thinking and give you the local knowledge and the environmental change knowledge that they have that may impact upon the way in which you want to respond. But more importantly, you've actually got to stay engaged with them day in, day out. And you've got to create some opportunities. And I saw another question there about engaging with communities and how you use their observations. And in some ways, this goes to answer that. It's not just about engagement when the event occurs, because if that's the case, then you're probably missing the golden opportunity to know how best to go with them on the journey of resolving the issue.
Okay, thank you for that. Alistair, your thoughts on, I guess, Tony referred to both the two questions. There's a question about, how do you find remote engagement in something like the area that you have in Queensland, and also how might that engagement with any community lead to a better understanding of observations and insights, rather than perhaps, as is suggested in the question, a collection of stories?
I think Tony has certainly given a very comprehensive answer. I think one of the things I'd like to highlight is obviously visiting remote and rural areas is very important, because it actually, you get an opportunity to walk and talk with others and hear what happened. You can also get a great visual reference, especially where there has been an event that leaves behind a footprint that you can quite clearly see. I think the important thing is we do also, where we can't get to communities, we do try to do telephone engagement surveys, but there are downsides to that. Not everybody has a home phone. Not everybody is able to provide the time that is required to answer the questions, and in some cases, telephone connectivity may be complex at the best of times. We're actually trying to do a piece of work looking at how do we have a better engagement with remote and rural communities. How do we get a greater understanding of the sentiment and the feelings and the thoughts that actually occurred during the event and immediately after the event. But I think one of the things is in the disaster management plan assessments that we undertake, and also in the capability reviews that we do, is to actually go and talk to people and visit people. And we're very mindful that that is the preferred way of doing business, and to have facilitated workshops where people can actually talk about what happened. And there is you talk about stories, but stories are invariably based on what they see and what they felt. And every person has a different feeling and a different thought when things happen. And one of the things is you could ask 5 people what they saw, and they would all be standing in a line, and they would all probably give you a slightly different version of what they saw. It's not because they saw something different. It's they just viewed it in a way that gave them a different perspective on it. So I think that being out, and especially out in the rural environment where IGEM can actually communicate with and engage with people is very important. And coronavirus or COVID-19 has definitely had to adjust the way in which we do our business, which is now through Teams meetings, through Zoom, such as we're doing today. We're trying to be as innovative as we possibly can, because these are processes that we may need to use again sometime in the future.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm thinking though that there's another layer to this question that we're close to trying to kind of get at the heart of it, but not yet. So I'll put it back to Tony, because I think, Alistair, you provided a good response to kind of some of those issues around consultation and differences in stories. But if we were to think about framing community engagement and consultation as an integral part of the lessons management process. I mean, at the end of this question, I think is the heart of it. What does that change in terms of how we might be interacting with communities, how your officers might be interacting with communities, and how do we then view their feedback, especially given what Alistair just mentioned about differences in stories. Although I know that, you know, for example, in debriefs, you know, we still have that very issue. So yet we can come up with insights and observations in some more integrated way. Tony, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for that, Christine. Look, I still go back to, I guess, to some degree to the point I made earlier. I think if, again, I support what Alistair is saying, you know, stories are very important, and we, in our inquiries, we will often use case studies and stories as examples of the experiences of people, community and otherwise, because of the richness of that experience. But having said that, you've always got to be cognizant of the fact that that experience is an experience in a moment of time that is in the midst of disaster and drama and tragedy. And therefore it impacts, people are impacted psychologically and physically by the environment in which they're in. So therefore, whilst the story is very important and the experience obviously of what they went through is really important, I still say that in order to get the best lessons outcome for a sector and for an IGEM to be able to assist with that, the value of that is the ongoing engagement with communities through the various processes and mechanisms that we have to do that, because you are talking to people about issues where they have time then to think about their environment. They have time to think about the resources they have available to them, and they have time to think about the relationships that they have with others, either in their family or in groups or otherwise. And then to socialise that in their own minds in a way that is not impacted by the emotion and the fear and the drama of what's going on around them at any given time. So I still say that whilst I agree with everything Alistair said in his commentary there, and the emotion and the experience of the event post-impact is really very important, I think it's only a very small part of where you get the value of learning from things. And it's about being able to go back again to look at past events and talk to people well after them when they're in a different place in their minds, to be able to get their real true thinking about what might the future look like. Otherwise, it's simply it is really an emotive response driven by a whole range of things that don't allow them the time to think that way.
Okay, thank you. Question for Alistair, and perhaps then Tony, I'll get your thoughts on it as well. What do you see as the greatest challenges to embedding both lessons practices and lessons identified at a state level?
I think some of the challenges have been around making sure that we consult widely, that we work closely with others, and that we actually take a framework that was developed. Our framework was developed out of, I suppose, the Tropical Cyclone Debbie review in 2017. So it's about embedding a positive culture and sharing lessons. So sometimes it can be quite hard to say, look, I don't think this went as well as what I was hoping it would do, or maybe some of the decisions that were made could have been improved upon. But I think one of the things around promoting a positive culture, and Tony's alluded to this, about going back and looking at other events and looking at marks in the ground and saying, well, what happened here? What happened there? How can we improve that? And sometimes we do learn lessons, and we often say, I went to a debrief and I picked up some lessons learned. Well, actually what you probably identified was lessons. So the actual embedding of the lessons is about trying to embed it into the culture or the response or the activities that you actually do. And so creating this this culture or feeling that it is okay to change things. Because if we keep doing more of the same, then we put more and more effort into doing more of the same, but we may not actually achieve an improvement in an outcome. And I think Einstein made some references to that in some past studies that he's done. But I think it's about accountability, it's about leadership, it's about supportive leadership and encouraging people to come forward and have their input. We open, in all our inquiries, we invite and open up to people making submissions that can be written after the event of time and can actually go back and refer to other events that have occurred. So it's about collecting the collection of the observations and distilling those into insights is really important, and then drawing down those particular lessons. And I think there are many occasions when we go back and we look at something and say, well, in hindsight, we probably could have learned something from that. How do we actually improve what we do? Because we constantly want to improve. We don't get out of bed in the morning and go, well, I'm just going to keep doing the same old thing because I know it's not going to work. Most people get out of bed in the morning to try and make a difference. And when we talk to local communities, they're passionate about improving. Some people have been in those areas for 50 odd years and they can tell it's exactly what happens when certain things occur. And I think it's important that we capture that knowledge for future.
Okay, thank you for that. A final question for Tony and a 30-second answer, a kind of tough one to try and do that. But there's a couple of questions here that actually refer to the national level. So how do we, what are the implications then for thinking about these reviews that have been taken in 2 jurisdictions, state jurisdictions, and how do we actually ramp that up to be kind of able to learn at a national level? Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. As good as I like to think IGEM in Victoria is, we're not the font of all knowledge in this space. So I mentioned in the outline of the methodology that we were using in this inquiry, the literature review, etc. One of the ways that we do that is we go back and look at everything else that's been done by everybody else in relation to other events to see what relationship that might have to what we've just experienced. So therefore, don't forget everything else around you, go back and look at it. And as I say, borrow with pride, don't plagiarise.
Okay, thank you for that. And in the final 30 seconds, I'll do the wrap up. So on behalf of everyone here who has attended today, and we did peak at 311 participants, I would like to thank our guest speakers for sharing their experience, their expertise, their knowledge and their time. When you exit this webinar, there'll be a very short questionnaire. We encourage you to complete that in order to give us feedback about the experience. There'll also be a link to the recording of this webinar, a couple of questions on that, that will be available on the AIDR website. While you're on the AIDR website, I'd encourage you to have a look at the lessons management collection, as well as the extensive suite of other resources available. I think we've got a lot out of today. Thank you very much for participating. Stay tuned because there will be more lessons management webinars announced shortly. And depending on where you are, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, or good morning. Bye.